tuning in. I know that if you're in Portland, and most of you are, probably, it's a super nice day outside, so thanks for taking time out to come and listen to me talk about the Great Divergence. It's been a heck of a month, folks. June 2020 really takes the cake for being a whole lot of things. So we talked a lot about founding fathers and racism and cops, and I wanted to get back to something broader, which is, just global dynamics, colonialism, comparisons between countries. This is a little bit of a follow-up to Guns, Germs, and Steel. If you were here for that, this will probably help you sort of put that in context and understand a little bit of a different viewpoint on it. But I like talking about this stuff. I wanted to talk about some big ideas, intellectual history, economic history, and I think it's going to be a good one. I think it's going to be fun. So thanks for tuning in, and hit me up in the chat with your questions, as always. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this Twitch channel. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel. I hate to say things like this, but it does make a difference, and it would make me very happy to reach a broader audience. I love doing this, and I will do this probably forever, as long as we're locked down, which in America seems like for the rest of time. But it would be cool to reach a wider group of people. So so please share this. Please tell your friends about it. Please like and subscribe. Smash that upvote. All those things. And yeah, so let's get to it. So I shared with you all this image of the Great Divergence, right? This idea. This is from The Economist, right? This idea that I'm coming to you live from, I think this is maybe Oxford somewhere. Anyway, decided to do something a little bit different rather than my unfinished or half-finished attic. Anyway, the Great Divergence. This is from The Economist. And this is probably something that you have internalized or you've seen or you've thought about. But as you can see, sort of, it's an idea that during the 1900s, or 1800s, 1900s, something happened where Europe, especially Britain, saw a, dramatic outgrowth in GDP per person, a huge outpouring of wealth. And, people have spent the last 100 years trying to explain why that happened. And there's there's a lot of bad explanations for it. There are some good ones, but there are a lot of bad ones. And with all things historical, I think that we have to avoid easy explanations, which is a big part of my gripes with Guns, Germs, and Steel, again, if you were there for that conversation. And so the Great Divergence has been attributed to all sorts of things about Europe, about the ecological and economic conditions, and I'm going to talk about some of those. But if you're a keen observer, good question. I don't actually know how the U.S. plots on this. I think that the U.S. is not. It doesn't map very well. I think that until around 1900, that it's probably somewhere in the middle of the chart. I have seen versions of this that include that, but most of the time they ignore it. The United States' development doesn't really contribute very well to any of the narratives, so it doesn't include, it doesn't involve, it doesn't end up on many of the charts. But I will talk a little bit about the United States in comparison to this. But this is actually, I'm glad you asked that, because most of what I'm going to be talking about today is going to involve a comparison between Europe and mostly China, Japan, but also India and South Asia where possible. But those of you who are paying attention will already notice probably some problems with this generally, that GDP per person isn't a particularly useful metric for understanding anything about a country or a people, and also that certain areas and countries are missing from this. Extremely keen-eyed observers will also understand that China, as a unit, is probably better compared to Europe as a whole in terms of geography and population. Same for India, rather than comparing China to England or China to the Netherlands. And that makes this chart just sort of not all that useful to begin with. And economic history is very easy to tweak with statistics. You know, you can pull all sorts of numbers to support whatever conclusion you're trying to come to, and it's very easy to manipulate the data. Piketty's work is very big on this. If you're familiar with him, I drew mostly from Kenneth Pomeranz, who wrote the Great Divergence. For this, he has pointed out the problems with this kind of data collection, and so there is. So I don't want to deny that Europe did become vastly more wealthy than the rest of the world in the late 19th, early 20th century. That would be a lie. That would obviously be not true. But this chart sort of belies what actually happened, and so that's what I'm going to talk about during this lecture. And one of the interesting things that Pomeranz talks about, and that I think is really interesting, is when it's inherently difficult and problematic to sort of compare countries, right? To compare nations or regions of the world, because they're not really comparable. It's very hard to draw one-to-one comparisons between two radically different or even like mildly different cultures or societies. So he approaches this as rather being mutual deviations from each other rather than any one being the norm. And this is sort of the problem with the Great Divergence chart, and just general the approaches to this question, is they assume that sort of the European model of development is the norm. That is how developed countries should progress. And that, I think, is a sort of ideological, methodological error, right? So when talking about this, I'm going to try to talk about what happened and treat neither Asia nor Europe as normative, right? They're both different models of progression, and we have things to learn from both of them. So bear with me. We're going to have to go like pretty far back to start. So if we want to talk about the Great Divergence, we have to start with Chingaskhan. All right, so again, bear with me. If we really want to understand how specifically China, but most all of East Asia, came to diverge economically, came to reach a different position than Europe, it starts way, way back in the 12th century. And it starts with the Song Dynasty. So the Song Dynasty was a fall of the Tang Dynasty, started in the 10th century AD, and was in many ways an early modern state. It was sophisticated in ways that let me make this a little bigger. Sophisticated in ways that Europe could at the time only frankly dream of. It had movable type, firearms, substantial firearms, handheld cannons, rockets, all sorts of things, sophisticated navigational equipments. They had an odometer, architecture that was well beyond anything that you would see anywhere else in the world, legal and conceptual advancements like substantial social welfare programs like old folks homes and a form of welfare for the poor, postal service, and joint stock companies to sort of spread out losses and profits from ambitious adventures. Notably, and this is particularly important to our conversation, the Song also had the first paper currency, the jiaozi, and more on that later. For reasons that are too complicated to go into detail here, in the early 12th century, the Song split into the northern and southern Song, and the north fell to Jurchen invaders and became the Jin dynasty. it's sort of just like wild how sophisticated and advanced the song were. They were already using coal in large quantities for smelting and for burning. They had the understanding of how steam worked and the early models of steam engines, which they did not use for industry, but they understood it very well. And there were millions upon millions of people living in a very stable, functional, Chinese state for hundreds of years. And this is at a time when England specifically, is a dirt poor backwater filled with, mud farmers barely making it. It is. You can look at the sort of per capita income of both of these countries, and just in terms of absolute poverty, Europe is an absolute, there's no reason anyone would ever go there if they had a choice. However, this state of affairs does not last. As I mentioned, Chingaskhan plays into this pretty significantly. So, as you probably know, Chingaskhan united the Mongol tribes, swept across the steppe. In around 1211, he subjugated the Jin, the northern Song Dynasty, and then they were fully conquered by his son Ogadai a little bit later. The Mongols kept an uneasy peace with the southern Song for about half a century, until Kublai Khan declared himself to be Emperor of China and decisively conquered the rest of China, the Song Dynasty, in 1279. Forming the Yuan dynasty, which lasted for not quite 100 years. So as I mentioned, the Song had what was the very first fiat currency, the first paper currency, and it was issued initially in present-day Sichuan by a private merchant enterprise. They were there to replace the heavy copper coins that were circulated. A lot of these merchant companies were subject to bankruptcy, so the government stepped in, nationalized the jiaozi, and managed the production of paper money, and founded sort of a series of mints to control and manage this currency throughout their reign. The Song Dynasty struggled with inflation. There were a lot of reasons for this, one of which was the outflow of currency to the neighboring Jin dynasty, but mostly not having enough specie copper coins to back the currency. So they would repeatedly issue different banknotes. There were a couple of different iterations on the jiaozi, but this was really quite innovative, right? This was one of the first paper currencies. I don't know if I have any, gold standard enthusiasts in the chat, but there are a lot of advantages to paper currency over, a type of currency that is directly linked to bullion. Unfortunately, if you do not have the financial and governmental mechanisms to control inflation, it's not so good. And so this became a problem for the Song Dynasty, and when they were conquered by the Yuan tried to go back to the copper coinage modeled after early Song currency, but they ran into trouble running out of copper and started printing their own banknotes. Under Kublai Khan, inflation rose again to 80% as the government kept printing more banknotes, and they banned the use of silver and gold coins. They stopped the circulation of certificates in favor of banknotes. So this sort of turned people off to fiat currency, to paper currency. And when the Ming overthrew the yuan in 1368, they tried to keep the banknotes for a little while, but ran into the same problems with inflation, and largely driven not by the government, by the preferences of individuals, specifically merchants who were trading outside of the Ming Dynasty. They switched back to silver currency, a coin called the Sasi or Yunbao, a little, silver, ordinary coin, back to the way that people had been doing coins for most of history. Now this is when things get interesting, in my opinion. So for the next 400 or 500 years, China is the main consumer of silver, and what's really interesting is that China has a great deal of natural resources within its borders, but very few silver mines, and so there was a massive flow of silver from elsewhere in the world to China, specifically from Latin America. And so what you see here is Cerro Rico, in Potosi, the rich mountain, which produced an estimated 60% of all silver mined in the world during the second half of the 16th century. Latin America produced 85% of all silver in the world between 1500 and 1800. And the vast majority of that silver went directly to China to be used as sort of basically to be turned into coinage. China was 40% of the world economy during this time. And so when you think about, when I think about, and when you think about, especially early American colonization, we often think of, Spanish galleons carrying, great deals of golden treasure back to Spain, and that did matter. But what really drove the early expansion and a lot of the inherent drive to colonize the New World was silver, and that silver flowed either indirectly through trade to merchants in the East who took it over the Silk Road, or later directly through the Manila galleon, directly to China. And I think it's, this is something that Pomeranz showed in another one of his articles, but China is very much responsible for driving early and middle New World colonization. The thirst and need and drive and the profitability of selling silver to China made New World colonization very, very attractive, especially to Spain and Portugal, but to all European countries who were able to finance certain expeditions, and the acquisition of silver, boosted the economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about how we got to the Great Divergence, right? So imagine a great flow of silver specie from the New World to Europe, to China, and this sort of connected global trade system. This is something that Pomeranz and others have showed quite definitively, but I don't think that it has quite made it into the public consciousness. But we humans were living in a very global society well before the age of sail or colonialism. It just moved a little slower, but the market mechanisms were already in place, and changes in what was happening in China very much drove the growth and social and political circumstances in Europe, especially at this time, since China was economically vastly more important than Europe was to sort of the global economic system. So let's talk about the 17th century, or 18th century, sorry. You'll remember from the chart at the beginning that things start to diverge around 1800, and they really take off around 1900. And so, let me make this map a little bit bigger for you. So, in around 1700, of course, we all know that the main players are England, France, Spain, and their colonies. The Manchu have conquered China, created the Qing Empire in 1644. The Mughal Empire controls the vast majority of India. Japan has formed the Tokugawa Shogunate, and these and the Russian Empire, of course, the Ottomans, are the main economic drivers of history at this point in time. And during this period, right, this is still before the really, let me say, rapacious time of colonial and imperial expansion. Most of what's happening is settlement in the New World. There is, a push by Europe to move into the East, but they still are having to negotiate on roughly equal terms with East Asian nations. And it's worth noting at this time that the standard of living and also sort of just the general circumstance of life in Europe as well as the rest of the world was not all that different. So in terms of calories, life expectancy, access to goods and services, Europe was roughly on par with parts of China, India, and Japan, and in many ways behind even in England, which is sort of going to be um, our lodestar, our sort of best example of European standard of living throughout this conversation. Um, Peasants in Asia, even peasants in Asia, had better access to food. It's worth noting that rice produces per acre substantially more calories and is more reliable than wheat. Beyond that, they had substantially better access to clean drinking water. And in China, especially quality textiles, cotton was grown there, and peasants in 1700, 1750 were wearing in China, Japan, India much better clothing than anybody in England would be wearing, or most working people in England would be wearing. And in especially in Japan and the wealthier parts of China, life expectancy was 5 or 10 years higher than it was in England, and much higher than it was in France or parts of Germany. And I didn't mention this earlier, but it's worth pointing out that when we talk about Europe, or when anybody talks about Europe, they're generally talking about Western Europe, and really like a very specific part of Western Europe: the Netherlands, England, most of France, and parts of Germany. Yes, how they lived. This is actually the Great Plague of Marseille that you're seeing here. So they lived, and then they died of plague. But if we're talking about Europe, it always very conspicuously excludes Eastern Europe, where well into the 1900s, or well into the 1800s, 19th century, large portions of the population, even Austria, were serfs. They were unfree. And the Mediterranean countries, Spain, Portugal, Italy, where there was a very wealthy upper class and some very, very poor peasants. My dumb shit ancestors come from there. A lot of yours do too. And so this is sort of like the deceptive nature of these comparisons, is that when historians, when economists talk about sort of the growth or the wealth of Europe, they're conspicuously excluding Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, large parts of Italy and Spain, and up and well until the 20th century, big parts of France. So there are complications to this, and there are certain ways where this is not entirely true. But generally, in large parts of China, Japan, and even India, which was of the large Asian societies the most unequal, you would have greater purchasing power, you would live longer, and probably be healthier, and your children would be less likely to die than in Europe. And this is true well into the 19th century. It only starts to change substantially after about 1850, and even then, not uniformly, right? It remains true in a lot of places well into the 20th century. And this is one of the problems with sort of comparing broad China, right, or India or Japan broadly to all of Europe, or to England specifically, or to France or Netherlands. Anyway, I'm getting off track. One of the ways that this is interesting is specifically with access to luxuries. And so, when you were thinking about wealth, standard of living, GDP, right, you think about who can get enough to eat, whether or not they have enough clothes to wear, whether or not they live to a ripe old age. But you also are thinking about what sort of goods and services they have access to. And one of the interesting things that a lot of researchers have done in the past 20, 30 years is show that in China especially, but also Japan and India, the rates of consumption of sugar, tea, coffee, tobacco were similar, if not higher than that of Europe. China is really interesting because in China they grew their own tobacco and sugar and tea in the country. They did not have to trade or produce colonies for that. So in many places in China, it was much cheaper and easier to acquire sugar, tea, and tobacco specifically, and which left a higher spending for things like entertainment, singers, actors, as well as ritual services, Certain material goods were more widely available in China and Japan than they were in Europe. And what's really interesting about this, to me, I don't know if it's interesting, but sugar becomes a crucial part of the English diet, more so than it does everywhere else in the world, because it's more than just a flavoring. By the middle of the 19th century, sugar is almost as much as 20% of the English caloric intake, largely because they did not have very good nutrition. They didn't have room to grow enough crops for good food. And while this may not sound like a particularly healthy diet for a working person, it is better to burn sugar calories than it is to burn protein calories. And so this, the access to vast quantities of sugar, yes, put in tea among other things, allowed the English working people to remain productive, if not particularly healthy, throughout this time period, which is a really interesting to me. It's a really interesting factoid, because sugar consumption is so high in England, but it is not a luxury good. It is a necessary staple for much of the 20th century. And an interesting part about this, and if you, this will show up sometimes in AP history course, world history courses, or other discussions of the world economy in the 20th century. But there's this famous quote by the Qinglong Emperor, the emperor in the the Qing Emperor in the early 19th century, where he says to Ambassador Macartney, who had come to China to sort of try to open up trade with England. The Qianlong Emperor says, "Yesterday, your ambassador petitioned my ministers to memorialize me regarding your trade with China, but his proposal is not consistent with our dynastic usage and cannot be entertained. Hitherto, all European nations, including your own country's barbarian merchants, have carried on their trade with our celestial empire at Canton. Such has been the procedure for many years, although our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its own borders." This is sometimes used as an example of how China had a closed stance toward the rest of the world and was not interested in new experiences or new products, but one that's dumb, because the emperor doesn't speak for all of China, and they traded extensively with elsewhere. And two, it sort of obscures the market realities, which is that, as I mentioned, during this entire time period, the most valuable thing a non-Chinese merchant could bring to China was silver. And you could bring all sorts of things that that China might find interesting, firearms or trade crafts or whatever, but none of it would make you as much money as just bringing as much silver as you could haul across the Silk Road or in a vessel. And within sort of their sphere of influence, China traded extensively with South Asia for things like shark fins, birds' nests, black pepper, and other goods. So it wasn't that China was particularly closed to new experiences. It's not that it was or is a closed society, and Europe is an open society, right, that makes it more accessible to trade and more dynamic. It's really just that the market realities up through the 20th century meant that China was less interested in trading for finished goods than it was for silver, because it needed that silver far more for its own internal trade and financial stability than it did Meissen porcelain or English textiles or whatever. So why then I have no idea how much a bird's nest was worth. I wish I had looked it up, to be honest. This was just an example in the book that I read. Has anybody had bird nest soup? I haven't. I'm doesn't sound good, but people seem to like it anyway. So something had happened, right? Something must have happened, and there are a lot of explanations for this. So I'm going to try to go through like the main explanations for the reason for the Great Divergence. And so a big one is the Industrial Revolution. And much credit has been given to the development of the steam engine. You can see the Watts engine here, and its impact on the development of wealth industry in Britain. And again, it would be wrong for me to pretend like it doesn't matter, but we really need to be careful when we talk about this, because there are substantial... It's pretty good? Okay. I have to try one. Can you even get bird's nest soup anywhere? Anyway, um, there are substantial social, economic, and market forces that impacted the development of labor-saving and labor-enhancing technologies like the steam engine, textile machinery, and steam pumps. In many cases, this remains true when we're talking about sort of market forces through the modern day to hire more labor than it is to invest in complicated and capital-intensive equipment. Outside of England, especially, industrialization was extremely limited until the very late 19th century, and even in England, its impact was mostly on one industry, the textile industry, where it did have a substantial impact, and it did drive sort of proletarianization of workers, and in certain circumstances, it did improve wages. But you can see this, what's happening right now. We hear a lot of chatter about how robots are going to take our jobs, but frankly, I kind of wish they would, but they're not going to, because it's so much cheaper to continue to pay people shit wages rather than to invest a bunch of money in robots to do those jobs for them. And this is exactly the same story as it is with industrialization. So it requires a certain certain pressures for industrialization to work in England, and there's a lot of reasons for that. You know. And we'll get into the specifics of it a little bit later, but there's some things to bear in mind. So China and England both have substantial coal deposits, but in England, and this is very interesting, they're closer to the coast and they're lower sea level, and so they flood. And so what was required to make them productive was pumps, steam pumps generally, to pump out the water. In China, there's actually there was an opposite problem. They were dry, and they were the greatest risk was actually spontaneous combustion. And there were ways that the Chinese dealt with that, but it was not by developing the steam engine. A steam engine would not have helped. Pumping, there was no water to pump out of the coal mines in China, right? They had to develop different methods of dealing with this particular problem. And so the development of textile machinery and steam pumps sort of played into each other in England. There was a reason for industrialization to progress as it did in England, which was not the same elsewhere in Europe or elsewhere in the world. It's also worth mentioning, when we're talking about GDP per person, that this did not create vast equality or wealth or profitability or even improved living standards. This almost goes without saying, but as late as the year 1900, industrial workers in the United States, for example, worked a 10-hour day, 12 hours in the steel industry, and earned anywhere from 20 to 40% less than the minimum deemed necessary for a decent life. Also, most workers in textiles, which is the leading industry in terms of employment, were women and children. Also, air pollution deaths in London specifically rose from 25 per 100,000 inhabitants in 1840 to 300 per 100,000 inhabitants in 1890. It was, I mean, some of our most miserable stories come from sort of the Victorian and Gilded Ages, of the late 19th, early 20th century. The GDP per capita measure really obscures what life was actually like for most people, which was fucking miserable. It was awful. So one, that's bullshit. But there's other reasons why it's bullshit. So, pretending that it matters, the GDP per capita thing matters. If it's not industrialization, right? If it's not superior market cap, if it's not, some sort of, technological innovation, what is it? Well, another popular explanation is the Protestant work ethic. Around the turn of the 20th century, Max Weber wrote a book called The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, where he theorizes that capitalism in Northern Europe specifically evolved when the Protestant Calvinist ethic encouraged people to work in a secular world, developing their own enterprises, engaging in trade and the accumulation of wealth, etc., etc., etc. There was something uniquely good about Protestantism that made people want to work hard and increase their wealth and engage in capitalism. this is dumb. I don't need to tell you that. But not only is it like obviously not true, but it's worth noting that again, the research has been done by scholars, but markets were no more or less free in China, India, or Japan than they were in Europe, and social and institutional restrictions were again no more or less helpful to the development of markets than they were in Europe. As an example, again, if you would like, if you're really interested in this, I encourage you to read The Great Divergence and a lot of the books that came after, because it's very, very interesting. I find this stuff to be pretty tedious, so I'm just going to like summarize some brief bits. But an interesting part of it is, gender dynamics in China. Women were encouraged to stay in the home, but within that context, they were encouraged to contribute to artisan crafting and production in ways that they were not in the West. Where women were either completely unproductive or forced into factories. And within these contexts as well, there were markets in India and in China that were substantially more free than they were in Europe. Europe had very powerful guilds well into the 19th century that basically protected the very wealthiest to the exclusion of all else. In England and France and Germany and basically everywhere, seigneurial rights and nobility rights were protected. Wealthy landowners and nobility had not absolute authority over their laborers, but substantial authority over their land. We discussed enclosure and other legal ways in which they, not in sort of the spirit of free capitalism, but with the explicit force of the state behind them, increase their wealth and power. So there is nothing inherently more productive or more friendly to capitalism in Europe as compared to the rest of the world, especially East Asia. This is absolute nonsense, both from a conceptual and from a statistical economic point of view. So what is it, right? What is the thing? Well, there's no one answer to this, but it is worth mentioning that there is a big, obvious elephant in the room, and you guessed it, folks, it's colonies. It's colonization, it is the New World, it is imperialism. So, it is the precursor to neoliberalism. As I talk about this, I think you're going to hear some things that are quite similar, but gosh, colonies are so interesting. Colonialism is so interesting to me because we often are led to believe that these were vastly profitable, but actually the truth is that colonies, imperialism in general, was in many cases and throughout much of history not actually profitable. It did not bring in great obscene wealth, except to small numbers of wealthy elites. In terms of sort of, if we were talking about sort of like trade balances, right? If this were a modern day conversation about exchange between countries, it's often flat. It's a it's a net negative. It's a net nothing. It's a wash. And it's important to remember that the colonies were only possible through slavery, coercion, and the threat of violence. As I mentioned before, vast imports of sugar helped feed the poor. A heavily subsidized production of cotton fed the textile industry. And vast quantities of raw materials, everything from food to timber, helped support a rapidly growing country. This is especially true in England, France, the Netherlands, where they had used up a lot of their arable and useful land a long time ago. And they were not prevented from, technologically growing their wealth or improving their circumstances, but it was made substantially more possible by these vast infusions of raw materials. And this was not a market economy, right? Not even profitable, right? And it was only possible through, again, the explicit and implicit threat of force. Huge trade balances up into as late as World War II, World War I, probably into World War II, but the numbers I saw were through World War I, were made possible by artificially protected markets in India and elsewhere, where everything from textiles to locomotives were sold, and again, further down the line, through coercive trade agreements with China. this had a downstream effect on all other industrializing nations, notably the United States, who benefited from being able to protect their markets completely and sell into unprotected ones and reap massive profits, right? It is hard to overstate how beneficial this arrangement was. We're having free markets on one end and completely closed protected ones on the other end was to the colonizing and industrializing nations. I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of mercantilism, but we have often thought that this, or taught that this ended, around the time of Smithian economics, but that's not true at all. And if this sounds like neoliberalism, shock, it does. The wealthy, developed nations of the world now protect their markets quite aggressively, and through the World Bank, the IMF, and just general trade aggressiveness, open markets elsewhere in the world, and create very advantageous trade conditions for companies in the developed world. This doesn't necessarily explain everything, right? China was powerful, wealthy, its people were doing well, so what happened? Well, again, there is no one simple answer, but it is worth noting that between 1839 and 1877, the Qing Dynasty fought 2 wars against the combined might of Western Europe and suffered 4 massive civil wars that resulted in, conservatively, 50 million deaths. I don't know that this is well known in terms of world history, but the late 19th century was absolutely catastrophic for China and the Qing Dynasty. The Taiping Rebellion and the Daijing Uprising killed millions of people and threw the country into absolute chaos. It is staggering, the loss of life. 50 million is more than any single country in Europe had at all at this point in time. And so when you look at that sort of that curve, right, you think about the state of the world, the state of China, the state of Japan and India, it starts to sort of make more sense when you think of it as not a sort of a linear progression of the West's superiority, but maybe a bump in a generally stable Eastern civilization. And I'm not showing this to dunk on anybody or to be cruel. I don't take any joy in the fact that that this is the way that things are. I live in the United States. All of you do too. I do not want to suffer through this particular catastrophe. I am not happy that 130,000 of my fellow citizens have died needlessly. But it's worth mentioning that Japan and Korea and China have largely suppressed the virus. Vietnam has 0 coronavirus deaths. And so the reason why I'm bringing this up is sort of at the end of this is that the idea of the Great Divergence and sort of the idea of Western or American exceptionalism is extremely dangerous. It has made us as a people weak and vulnerable. And I would say that, yes, absolutely, we can blame Trump and certain, immediate circumstances for why we're in the situation that we're in. But it is our failure to cope with or to grapple with or to understand properly our history, in my opinion, that has made us vulnerable ideologically to what's happening right now, right? The reason why we are unprepared for a pandemic, why we are unprepared for climate change, why our institutions are sort of grinding to a halt and failing to adapt to the 21st century in a meaningful way, has to do with the lie that we have told ourselves about why we're better than everybody else, right? Why the West, why the United States, why England is superior. And the truth is that, one, that superiority is kind of a lie. If we're talking about how people lived, I'm not sure that it's really been true, except for maybe a brief period. And 2, it misunderstands the reasons why that happened. And I hope that if you've been listening to me yammer for months now, guns, germs, and steel, and this and everything else, a lot of it is luck. A lot of it is England had coal deposits in the right place. Um, England, happened to land on the right shores at the right time. China suffered a catastrophic, plague and invasion and floods and rebellions at the wrong time. This could have all gone very, very differently. And so anybody who sits atop history and says, well, we're the best, and there's a reason for that, this is just how it was meant to be, makes themselves vulnerable as a people to obvious attacks, flaws, errors of oversight. And so I have absolutely no faith that anybody in power is going to have this reflection in this country anytime soon. But hopefully you will, and hopefully the people who listen to me will, and will understand that you can love this country. Look, it's my home. This is where I live. This is where my people are, right? You can care about America. You can love this country. You can care about the West even without being a weird racist. Maybe, I don't know. That's a gray area. Probably not. But let's just stick to you can care about your country. And you can, but that involves telling the truth about it. That means being honest about it. That means understanding how we got to where we are. And I'm pretty sure that nobody is going to seriously talk about American exceptionalism any soon, given what's happening. But what is next, right, is an honest assessment of where we are, how we got here, and how we exist in comparison to other societies around the world. And so I hope this has been interesting and educational and useful for you. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Friday and a great weekend. And I'll see you all next week.